Hi again! In the previous episode, we finished the work of improving the jumping mechanics. In this episode, we will create an enemy that is able to move and change its direction. Let's get going then. First, we need to slice the sprite sheet that contains the graphics for the enemy. Select enemy_snail and change the sprite mode to multiple. Then, open the sprite editor. From Slice, choose Grid by Cell Size and change the pixel size to 256 x 256. Hit Slice and click Apply. Before adding the enemy into the scene, we need to enlarge the level a bit. Select the slope on the right and remove it. Then duplicate few of the flat ground pieces so that there is enough space for the player and the enemy to move. Also remember to adjust the collider accordingly. Next, drag the first frame of enemy_snail into the scene. Rename it to enemy snail. Then we need to add some components. Go ahead and add a rigid body 2D and a circle collider 2D. From rigid body, freeze the rotation on Z-axis. Now, let's focus on the collider. The idea is that the player can defeat the snail by jumping on top of its shell, whereas the player gets defeated if it hits the snail's body. We will use the circle collider as a physical boundary for the shell, which will be safe for the player, and then create an empty child object and give it a trigger collider which will, if hit by the player, result in a game over. But now, let's adjust the circle collider. Change the radius to 0.61, offset on X to 0.14, and on Y to -0.53. Don't mind about the fact that the collider doesn't cover the shell completely. This is intentional. You will find it out later. Then, click on Layer from the top of the inspector and select Ground. We do this because we want the player to be able to jump from the top of the shell. Next, right-click the snail on the hierarchy and select Create Empty. Name it as Trigger. Then, give it a Box Collider 2D component and activate the IsTrigger checkbox. When you're done, click on Edit Collider button and adjust the collider so that it roughly covers the body of the snail. And finally, assign the enemy tag to this child object. Before we start coding, we need to create an invisible trigger area that we will use to turn the enemy around. Create an empty game object and name it to enemy trigger. Make sure it is not a child of any game object. Reset the position and create a new tag for it. Name the tag as enemy trigger. Remember to assign the tag to the object after creating it. Then add a Box Collider 2D component and set it as trigger. Drag the game object into Prefabs folder so that we can use it on other levels as well. After that, place a game object on the ground before the snail and duplicate it. Move the duplicate behind the snail. Now we have defined an area where the snail can move. Okay, now we can start coding. Create a new script and name it as enemy snail. Attach the script to the snail and open it. First, we will create few variables. Write public float speed equals to minus 0.5f. The reason we assign a negative value is that we want the snail to move to the left towards the player in the beginning. Next variable will be boolean, and it will store the information or whether the snail is alive or not. Write private bool is dead. We will still write 3 variables more. Write private rigid body 2D RB, and after that private box collider 2D heat collider. We will use the heat collider to store the box collider component that the snail's child object has. Finally, write private player. We will use this to access a variable from the player script. Then let's go to start function and find some components for these variables. Write RB equals to get component rigid body 2D. For hit collider, we need to use a slightly different command, since the component is on the child object. Write hit collider equals to get component in children, box collider 2D. And lastly, write player equals to find object of type player. Alright, now the components are stored. Let's get to update function. Change it to fixed update. We will write a very simple if statement here, which will move the snail if it's not dead. So, write if exclamation mark is dead. Then, inside of the curly brackets, write rb.velocity equals to new vector 2 speed 0f. Next, we will turn the snail around when it hits the trigger. For this purpose, we will use the onTriggerEnter function. Write void onTriggerEnter 2D, collider 2D, other. Now, in the if statement, we want to check if the snail hit the trigger area or the player. We didn't assign the player a tag yet, but we can do it afterwards. Write if extra parenthesis other.gameObject.tag 2 equality signs enemy trigger 2 vertical lines other.gameObject.tag 2 equality signs player and outside of the extra parenthesis 2 ampersands exclamation mark is dead. There is a tag called player in Unity by default, so we can just assign that to the player later. These conditions will be met when the snail is alive and hits the player or the trigger area. Then, inside of the curly brackets, write speed equals to minus speed. This will always change the speed to the opposite direction. Next, we need to think about the flipping of the snail. This time we can't use the flipX option from Sprite Renderer because it will only flip the sprite, not the game object itself. The collider of the snail is not symmetrical, so if we only flip the sprite, the collider will not be in the right place. We can flip the whole game object by changing the scale on x to -1. In Unity, when you change the scale to a negative value, the game object will be mirrored along the axis direction. So, write transform.localScale equals to new vector 3 and parenthesis. Inside of the parenthesis, we need to define the value for x, y, and z. We don't need to modify y and z, so we can just set them to 1f. For x, we will take the current scale and multiply it with -1 so that it will be always mirrored correctly. Write transform.localScale.x asterisk -1, 1f, 1f. Let's save the script and test it. Before testing, remember to assign the correct tag to the player and to apply the changes to the prefab. Great, it works! The snail changes direction when it collides with the player or the trigger area. Next, we will add the possibility to defeat the snail. Let's get back to code. At the bottom, write void on collision enter 2D, collision 2D other. The reason why we use this function and not on trigger enter is that the collision between Snail's shell and the player is a physical collision. Now, for the if statement, we need the following conditions. The game object that collides has to be the player, and both the snail and the player must be alive. So, write other.gameObject.tag player 2 ampersands exclamation mark player dot is dead 2 ampersands exclamation mark is dead. Then we want that the player can't die when he touches the defeated snail. First of all, write is dead equals to true. After that, we will disable the trigger collider and the restriction on rotation. Write hit collider dot enabled equals to false. And under it, rb dot freeze rotation equals to false. Alright, let's save the script and test it out. Awesome! It works as it should. We are almost done. Only things left to deal with are the animations. Open the animation window and create a new clip for the snail. Save it in the animations folder and name it as Enemy Walk. Drag the first frame to the timeline. The next frame to 0.07 seconds. Then enemy underscore snail underscore 2 to 0.14 seconds. Enemy underscore snail underscore 1 to 0.21 seconds. Enemy underscore snail underscore 0 to 0.28 seconds. Enemy underscore snail underscore 3 to 0.35 seconds. Enemy underscore snail underscore 4 to 0.42 seconds. Then another enemy underscore snail underscore 4 to 0.55 seconds. enemy underscore snail underscore 3 to 1.02 seconds. And enemy underscore snail underscore 0 to 1.09 seconds. Great, the first animation is done. Let's make the second one. Create a new clip and name it as enemy death. Drag the frame enemy underscore snail underscore 5 to the timeline. Then drag the frame 6 to 10 to the timeline as well, always leaving 0.02 seconds between each frame. When you're done, select the enemy death animation for the animations folder and switch off the loop time checkbox. Next, open the animator window. First, create a new parameter, which is the type of trigger, and give it a name death. Then, make a transition from walk to death and add the condition you created to it. After that, uncheck the exit time checkbox and change the transition duration to 0.03. Last thing to do is to activate this transition from the code. Open the enemy Snail script. First, we need to create a variable that stores the animator component. Write private animator anim. Then, on start function, write anim equals to get component animator. And lastly, on collision enter, we need to activate the transition when the player touches the shell. So, write anim.setTrigger death. Okay, that's it. Save the script and return to Unity. Perfect! The animations work as they should. Great work! Now we have a moving enemy. The player is able to defeat it by jumping on top of its shell, and after that, shell can be pushed around. But if the player hits the enemy on its body, it will be a game over. In the next episode, we will create an obstacle that the player can deactivate by pulling a lever. Before you go, drag the enemy into the prefabs folder. Remember to save the scene. See you in the next episode.